Hey everybody. In this video, I'm going to go over some key points from the first chapter of the textbook we're using this semester, which is titled Theories of Personality. The first chapter is titled Introduction to Personality Theory. We'll go over some of the key points such as what is a person, what is personality, what is a theory, and how does it differ from, say, predictions or hypotheses or speculation? Then we'll finish up with some other key points before recapping. As with any area of study, you have to discuss foundational knowledge, those essential key points that really do lay the foundation on which to build throughout the rest of the course, the rest of the textbook, the rest of the literature, etc. So when you're talking about personality, the root of that word is person. And if we're going to be talking about those key traits and mechanisms of personhood, or what it means to be a person, we need to establish what a person is. So I'll let you hit pause here and brainstorm on answers to the question of what is a person. Hopefully you took the initiative to actually hit pause and brainstorm. But even if you didn't, you're encouraged to Google it, think about it, ruminate on it. And I think you'll find if you go through this exercise that it's kind of hard to define something that can seem so obvious. It's like when people tell you describe air or describe water. It's like it's so obvious, it's hard to put words on it. But if you're like other students in other sections of classes that I've taught, they come up with answers like a human being or a Homo sapien or an individual that has free will and higher executive functioning ability. So there are many ways to define a person, just like there are many ways to define personality. The one that we're going with is naturally going to be the one that is presented in the chapter. And that definition is it's a pattern of relatively permanent traits and unique characteristics that give both consistency and individuality to a person's behavior. So personality can come in many forms. There are both traits, those meaningful individual differences, but also mechanisms that are also meaningful individual differences that may not be easily captured in definitions like traits, but they may be more systems or conglomerations of mechanisms, ways of thinking, ways of feeling, ways of experiencing that still do a very good job of describing a person in terms of their consistent, enduring patterns that are with them across time, across situations, etc., that do a really good job of distinguishing them from other people and speaking to their uniqueness. So an example of personality trait could be a person's level of privilege. Privilege is a concept that has been studied in depth in more recent years in various areas: sociology, psychology, criminal justice, anthropology. All of these areas you'll see a fairly healthy literature focusing on privilege. So what I've done is found an online quiz to help you test your level of privilege. And so once you take the test, note your level. And then think about whether or not this level of this trait says something about you and your enduring pattern or ways of being, thinking, feeling that are consistent across time, across situations, that do a really good job of distinguishing you from other people. So remember, personality is a fairly diverse concept. It's not just the case that you have traits like shyness and extroversion and conscientiousness. You also have characteristics that don't perhaps speak to those meaningful individual difference variables, but perhaps they're things like your body type. Now, those are meaningful individual difference variables, but they don't really speak to how you may feel about the world, see yourself, see the world, experience different stimuli, etc. But it does describe you in some way, right? So physical makeup, how tall, how short, how heavy, how light, etc. you are. So there are other characteristics other than just traits and mechanisms that speak to our personhood, our uniqueness, if you will, among other people. But in this class, naturally, we're going to focus more so on traits and other characteristics like temperament, not so much physique or things like that. Next up, what is a theory? Now, I know this, like many other concepts, you were introduced to in other classes and may have discussed in depth in other classes, and respect to those. But as is always the case, every textbook is a little different, every area of study is a little different. Even if there's overlap, there may be unique terms, unique definitions for common terms, common methods, if you will. So the definition of a theory in this text is a set of related assumptions that allows scientists to use logical deductive reasoning to formulate testable hypotheses. Some of my students in other sections of this class comment often on how different this definition of a theory is from, say, the definition they see in their research methods class or their statistics class or their social psychology class. And I totally get it. But what I encourage you to do is to focus on the commonality among those rather than the differences in terms. So a theory, it's a statement basically that's supposed to do a good job of taking into account what's already known and predicting future research hypotheses, etc. So an example of a theory that we could apply to this concept of privilege that we've been talking around is privilege theory is the idea that oppression works through a series of unearned advantages for some and unearned disadvantages for others. That's a theory, right? It is a set of related assumptions. We're talking about unearned advantages and unearned disadvantages. So we're talking about related assumptions. It's this notion that it's a series of constructs or systems that are working together to basically maintain oppression. So it's a set of related assumptions that allow scientists to use logical deductive reasoning. Again, based on what the theory says, we can then deduce some predictions or hypotheses for future research. Now, a theory is differentiated from something like a philosophy or something like a speculation. Philosophy is much broader than a theory. It doesn't have to necessarily take into account research that's been done. It doesn't have to point researchers or scientists in a new direction in terms of future research. It doesn't have to lay groundwork for deductive reasoning that can end in hypotheses. It's just a statement. So an example of a philosophy related to privilege would be, the world is an unfair place, and that's not by accident. Now, it may be true, but it's not testable. It'd be very difficult to generate some testable hypotheses based on this philosophy. Similarly, a theory is different from speculation. Speculation could be pure conjecture, or it could be based on something more substantive than conjecture, but there are really no constraints or parameters on it either. It's just that, it's speculation. Speculation can be tied to empirical data and science, but it doesn't have to be. Hypotheses. Now, when we have formal theories, we can deduce hypotheses from those theories. Hypotheses, though, do not have to stem from theories. We can generate hypotheses just based upon our observations or hunches, or literally just some hunch or wives' tale or joke, if you will, that we've come across in our day-to-day lives. They don't have to come from the published literature. But a hypothesis, broadly defined, is a specific guess that can be tested using scientific methodology. An example of a hypothesis, again, related to this notion of privilege and privilege theory that we've been talking around, is people with more unearned privileges will be more hostile towards social support policies compared to people with fewer unearned privileges. Now, that's something we could test. We could collect some data from a group of people who have more privilege and from a group of people who have less privilege. And we could ask those two groups, hey, how do you feel about social support policies? How do you feel about welfare? How do you feel about WIC? How do you feel about EBT? How do you feel about farm aid? How do you feel about paying farmers millions of dollars to not plant crops so that grocery store prices don't tank? How do you feel about paying farmers millions of dollars because a president has ruined their ability to make money because of trade wars that his tweets have caused? It would be possible to design a research study to address that hypothesis. And certainly, we can differentiate a formal theory from a taxonomy. While they are very similar, theories and taxonomies are different. Taxonomies refer to classifications according to naturally occurring relationships or relationships that have been highlighted through statistical analyses. The question of why are there different theories is it's a loaded one. I won't say it's a trick question, but it is a loaded one. Obviously, there are different theories because there are different theorists. There are also different theories because different theorists have taken different approaches to answering questions, asking questions, developing methodologies, etc. So these theorists and other researchers have different personal backgrounds. They also have different philosophical orientations. And as a result of those two, they have unique ways of looking at the world. And because they have different ways of looking at the world, naturally, they would have different ways of trying to answer these questions that they have about the world. This brings us to the concept of the psychology of science. The psychology of science refers to an area that considers fairly equally both the science and the research and the literature and the lived experiences and the lives of the scientists. So it's weighting fairly evenly what is studied and who is doing the studying, basically. So the concept that the personalities and psychology of different theorists influence the kinds of theories that they develop is key in this area called psychology of science. I thought as a spotlight, we'd take a look at Peggy McIntosh. In your textbook, oh gosh, there's maybe one woman that is emphasized and focused on, and that frankly is criminal because there are a lot of women who've done some really good work in the areas of psychology and certainly in personality, but they just don't receive fair coverage in the literature. So, as an example here, we'll look at Peggy McIntosh. She is an American feminist and anti-racism activist. She's a scholar, a world-renowned and highly sought-after speaker. She is retired from the academy, but she's still on the public speaking circuit. She's also working with a number of nonprofit agencies, one of which is the Southern Poverty Law Center here in Montgomery, Alabama. And she's also a senior research associate of the Wellesley Centers for Women. She's the founder of the National Seed Project on Inclusive Curriculum. She was born in the 1930s in Brooklyn, New York. Now, some of you may be familiar with Maxine Waters. Some people refer to her as Auntie Maxine. She is not, so to speak, a scholar, but she is an elected official out of California. She was born in St. Louis in the 1930s, and her clapback is world renowned. Some of you may not necessarily be familiar with her name, but she's the woman who made the phrase "reclaiming my time" famous in the past couple of years. So she and this woman have a lot in common. They were both born in the 1930s. They're both feminists. They're both anti-racism activists. They take different perspectives in terms of their fight against sexism and racism, but they have a lot in common. Now, if we go back to the psychology of science concept, we're thinking about both the body of work and the worker. Now, so looking at Peggy McIntosh, I would imagine she has experienced some things in her life that brought out this feminist and anti-racism activism and caused it to be manifest in the way that it is. But a Black woman born dirt poor, also coming up in 30s and 40s and 50s and coming of age in the 30s, 40s, and 50s might have a different take on feminism and a different take on racism. And she may have a different approach to trying to change and make things better for herself and for others like her. So I just wanted to highlight that as an example of how we could apply the psychology of science to the lived experience of, say, Peggy McIntosh and her body of work, and to a Maxine Waters and her body of clapback. Another concept: what makes a theory useful? What are some of the criteria for evaluating a theory that we have? Well, a useful theory should meet all of the markers on this page. It should generate research. It should point researchers in the next direction of what should or should not be focused on. It should also help them contextualize, in light of what's already known, future findings. Should be falsifiable or verifiable, such that it should generate some hypotheses that allow it to be either supported or refuted. It should do a good job of organizing the known data. It should not fly in the face of what's already been established in the literature. It should guide action, be internally consistent and not conflicting with itself. And it also should be parsimonious. It shouldn't have 23 chapters and 42 subsections. It should be fairly straightforward and easily understood. And so I have a little call out there on the slide regarding privilege theory that you can read through. Now, the dimensions for a concept of humanity. This is an area that you will see in every chapter of this textbook, where the authors have analyzed these concepts as it relates to the theorist being studied. So this part of your chapters will focus on whether or not the respective theorists embody a more deterministic versus a free choice orientation, a pessimistic versus optimistic orientation, and so on. Regarding research, we're going to try to spend as much of our time not just studying theorists and their lives, but studying the literature so that we can know not just what happened, say, 100 years ago in terms of, literally 100 years ago, in terms of Freud and what he was writing about and thinking about, but what's going on right now in a laboratory at Alabama State that's going to contribute to the literature. So we're going to try to split it up. But research in personality theory, definitely theory should provide direction and meaning to the data. That's why we try to employ theories as much as possible in this area. But you will notice that it is one of the most atheoretical areas in the literature. But theory does give meaning to data. Data come from experimental research and scientific research, not just experimental research, designed to test hypotheses generated by said theories. And we try to make systematic observations, ones that are very well detailed and that could be fairly easily replicated in different laboratories on different campuses, on different continents, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the two empirical criteria for instruments that we hit pretty hard in most of our psychology courses are reliability and validity. And here in the call out on this screen, I pose the question, if you took the privilege questionnaire and you saw your scores on it, do you think that your scores are reliable? If so, how and in what way? And do you think your scores are valid? Again, if so, how and in what way? And if you don't think they're either of those things, again, why don't you think? Explain. So that brings us to the end of this first video, which focused on the material in chapter 1. We highlighted the concept of person or personhood, personality, psychology of science, theories, what they are not, what they should accomplish, etc., and other things that may be somewhat unique to the textbook, but very important to the overall study of personality theory as a whole. Thanks very much, and in the next video, I'll focus on chapter 2.